our series with Bond, and delighted to be here with MzN again, Chris, who we've worked with over the last couple of years. Delighted to be in partnership with them again on this current series, looking at new forms of funding. We're doing two series actually with MzN, one on funding, one on agile working. So look out on the Bond website for that series as well. But today we start with funding. And obviously lots of interesting things going on there with, issues relating to FCDO, but also the increasing thinking around locally led funding strategies, and also, the rise of likes of Gates and SIF and those foundations, and whether they're filling some of the gaps that are being left by government funding. Anyway, we'll explore those in due course. Just to say, this session is going to be recorded, so both slides and the session itself will be available to you afterwards. The session is also captioned, so if you go to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, there's a button marked CC. If you want to see a transcript as it goes through. It's automated, so we can't vouch for 100% accuracy. So it's approximate, but almost exactly right. Speak clearly, Chris and Janina, and it'll translate even better. If you want to ask questions, please pop those in the Q&A box. We'll have presentations from Janina Haynes from Integrity Action and Chris from MzN, and there'll be a chance to ask questions towards the end. But please ask them as you go along, and we'll come to those at the end. And I'm really delighted to have two great speakers today, so I'm going to hand over to Chris, and you take it from here, Chris. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Much appreciated, and wonderful to see so many of you here again. I do hope that this caption works with the German accent. If not, we may have a problem, or rather, I don't, you do. Right, let's kick it off. Colleagues and friends at Bond have asked us today to talk about this funding, and funding is a hotly discussed, ever-present topic, but the funding paradigm, the underlying dynamics behind it are rarely discussed. So we're hoping today to discuss those whilst not being overly principled, but also pragmatic. So introductions first. And since it's ladies first, Janina, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself first?
Let me unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Janina Haynes. I'm the CEO of Integrity Action. Integrity Action is a UK charity working in international development space, and we focus on citizen-centric accountability.
Short and sweet, perfect. Thank you very much, Janina. My name is Chris. I'm the Managing Director and still majority owner of MzN International. We are a non-profit for non-profits. My colleagues around the world, that's not all of them, just some of them are literally around the world. Some of them are joining us today. Some of them are in other conversations. And I don't want to talk too much about us. But those who don't know, basically our mission is to build better NGOs and help them to be funded better. That's in a nutshell it. Right, enough about us. Let's talk about funding. And obviously we work a lot in this area, but it is not actually worthwhile. It is not actually the most important question. It is definitely the first, but it is absolutely my question for us organizations who work towards the SDGs on whatever mission it is you work on, not the most important question. I think what makes it the first question is something that a candidate in a sprint workshop we've had last year has summarized better than I ever could. The quote is at the bottom. It says, look, how we fund ourselves is not somehow separate from what we do. How we fund directs how we produce impact. And that really summed it up for me, and hopefully it speaks to you as well. And there are sort of 5 dynamic and paradigm questions behind it that are worthwhile considering before we consider our funding strategy. And to sum those up, before I ask Janina to maybe speak towards her funding challenges or her funding philosophy, is these 5 questions I put there on my left-hand side. Is it fair? Is it fair to fundraise in the North for projects in the Global South? Is it enough? Most NGOs will ask, or many of our partners we work with say, no, there's never enough unrestricted money. Does the funding we have or the funding we get actually fit the problem we're trying to solve? And I'm yet to see the complex change that fits into a 3 to 4 year project plan. So if the funding strategy is just to get the next grant, does that fit the problem we're trying to fix? And then I think it's also fair to ask ourselves and those who work with us, is that really how we want to work? You know, lots of partner NGOs we work with said, you know, we do not sign up to write endless donor reports. I want to work at an NGO, not a government institution. And that is not really what we want to do. And finally, does it actually make sense? You know, there's this well-known 8-worker rat race: get a grant, implement, panic, get another grant. Does that actually distract from solving the problem? Does it make sense? Or is this an acceptable pain? And Jasmina, at this point, you know, I would love to hear from your perspective if that reflects on your organization or if that is just completely out of the blue for you.
I think these are excellent questions, and our thinking and philosophy absolutely aligns to many of things you're mentioning there. But before I go there, and in case if you have missed the discussion at the Bond's last annual conference, I want to just quickly share with you the approach Integrity Action has adopted when it comes to fundraising, and it speaks to loads of those points. Our fundraising planning doesn't start with discussion on how much money we need to raise to cover the programs we have either planned, committed to, or commitments we have made to partners, to staff, costs, overheads, and etc. And do I mention, dare to mention the percentage increase year-on-year growth to reassure funders that we are rising star worth the investment. Our starting point is a discussion with peers and partners whose missions are very closely aligned with ours about the change that we can realistically expect to see, and then followed with thinking about what exactly we should do. And in discussion on that, what we should do, we are driven by our added value and avoiding duplication. And only once we are clear about that, we will progress into costings and then carefully selecting funders that we will prioritize speaking to. And the reason why we shifted to this approach really speaks directly, Chris, to questions that you have raised. And for us, there were 4 key driving reasons. First one is that we're deeply committed to working with partners to support locally led and inclusive agendas and solutions. We call it our gender and justice approach. When it comes to fundraising, this means that we don't create programs in the UK and then send them over to partners for a quick checkup and okay before submitting it to funders. We listen to what citizen monitors, partners and communities we work with have to say and then act on their recommendations. What I think is important to say here is that we will step aside if we are not adding value or if local actors can deliver the same or greater value. Once initiatives are shaped, then we will, and if we are the right organization to be part of it, we will then find or help find right funders and etc. Secondly, what we wanted, the second reason was that we wanted to get off that hamster wheel of permanently chasing money and thinking that we don't have enough. When you carefully and brutally, honestly select programs and initiatives that your organization will focus on, not only will your fundraising offer become clearer, but you also have an amount in mind that is probably far more realistic to raise. For us, this means that we have far more resources to focus on chasing impact rather than funders. And then in return, the funders that we do approach tend to respond a lot better because we've had more time to carefully understand their priorities and we're better able to understand how our mutual efforts are aligned. The third reason was, and this goes straight again to your point, Chris, was that We want to deliver medium and long-term programs that make difference. And we're not interested in 1, 2, 3, 4 years long projects. Planning programs and fundraising, the way I spoke about, it really enables us to do exactly this, to be driven by changing needs on the ground and able to respond to them. And when you do that, you kind of smooth over this transition from individual projects that stop, start, plan again, shape something from scratch, and etc. And then the final point was, and this is very navel gazing a bit, was I really want everyone at Integrity Action to feel that we're supporting the positive change rather than being stuck in that never-ending project admin, even if there is an admin to do and forever will be. To me as a CEO, it's very important that how my team feels and what they think. And I want them to feel and know that they're valued and respected for committing their careers to making the world a better place. And by being a part of organization that is driven by impact rather than fundraising targets, I think we're making that reality. They don't hear the executive team constantly scream and panic about, oh my word, we're 20% off, we're 50% off, and etc. Instead, we will say, okay, let's talk honestly about what works, what doesn't work. Are we the right organization to do it? How do we support partners better? A very quick rattle through. Hope it was clear.
No, that is super clear, and I promise you, we didn't actually align our presentations before, but that really feeds in quite well. And what I like here, what is remarkable is that you've clearly, Jasmina, you looked inside your organizations before you started looking outside for funding, right?
Absolutely. I have been around for enough years to know if you're constantly focused on your individual organizational needs, if your planning cycle starts with a fundraising number, then you have it wrong way around, because then you will start looking at who are the funders who will best meet my targets. And then you begin to twist and change your programs and what you do to fit into that mold. I really don't think it's the right way around. That's how we have ended up with all sorts of problems in this sector. For me, let's start with the first and the most important starting point, what we are here to do.
Absolutely. And also puts the beneficiary, the person who is ultimately benefiting from the impact, at the center of what you do from the very beginning, right?
For our citizens are the center of our universe. Whether we have done a good job or not, they're the only ones who can say. If a mother has an access to maternal services free of charge, as they should be, if her child can go to school, that's safe school to attend, yes, absolutely, we have done our job. But if not, forget about how fundraising success is or not. It doesn't really matter.
Great. I love how we're putting back into this conversation around funding what really matters, and it's ultimately about the impact. Be that the school, be that the health clinic, be that the free press, be that whatever. And Jasmina, feel free to just sort of pitch in and interrupt me by unmuting or lifting as we go through the remaining. I think it's about 6 or 7 slides. So hopefully this becomes more of a conversation like we have right now. But it connects beautifully to the next one here, which is purposely confusing. By the way, the slides will, I think, be shared with you, so you don't need to make frantic notes if you want this or after. Funding seems a bit odd for me as a consultant to say. Maybe that funding is often portrayed as a science, as something you need experts and consultants for, and that is not necessarily true. And there are all kinds of fancy terms here. Some of them are picked them at randomly on the left. Most of them you will recognize. That is not really true. And what I want to do today is really get down to the basics of the experience my colleagues and I made over the last 15 years or so. So following on to what Jasmina just described, the 3 questions I'm hoping to answer today are very simple. Look in, as in what do we actually have? Look around, what funding do we really need? And then look ahead and how do we start? Which is aligning fantastically with just what you just said, Jasmina. This look in first and then look around our partners and then look ahead, which is in different words, hopefully around about what you've just said. And I'm hoping to mix some principled as well as very pragmatic tips in the next couple of slides here. So let's start with a straight away with the most important thing to look in. And every journey obviously starts with a goal. Jasmina, you just described your annual planning. It might be a 4-year planning, it might be a quarterly, it doesn't really matter. But what really is important is to analyze first at what we have. Where do we actually lack the funding? What type of funding applications are we actually successful with? What fund or fundraising capacities do we have internally or connected through our partners and through our partner organizations? And then do a sort of a funding strength and weaknesses. So having a look at what are our capacities, where do we lack, where are we currently successful, what capacities can we employ as we set out on the next period of funding, be it a year or 4-year plan, doesn't matter. And a pragmatic tip here is to set a BHAG. Now, I'll happily sponsor a coffee, drink beer for everybody who knows what a BHAG is. Mike, any ideas?
Is it a big, hairy, audacious goal?
Awesome. And I want to, that is exactly, it's a big, hairy, audacious goal by Collins and Porras. I want to get back to that in a second. Just save that in a factor of your mind. And to make this practical, I thought I'll share with you sort of a very simple mix of a partner organization we worked with recently and we continue to work with. And they just look at the current year funding mix and the weighted average over the last 5 or 6 years. And they just said, look, on the funding we have, this is not fancy financial wizardry. We just look at that, nearly 2/3 are FCDO, nearly 20% or so is our fundraising campaign, and then there's some other stuff. And if we looked at over the last 5 years and weigh it so that the years are equal, so we weigh out the growth in funding, then it is EU and FCDO still, or what was then DFID, of course. And interestingly enough, here is the conclusion that some people in the team really spend a lot of attention on the fundraising campaign, the unrestricted, whereas the majority of funding clearly comes from the institutional grant holder. So that's clearly where we are more successful. And then we dove a little deeper and said, okay, which type of application is useful? And that is a very simple thing. You don't need anybody else for, but internally, and maybe some, have a look at your even published financial statements. And then we did a list of the business development capacity. In this case, there were 3 people, full-time equivalent, 1 part-time consultant. There was a notification service, a consultant who scanned for bidding opportunities on a weekly basis, and a quarterly business development workshop that was a set diary where the BD team comes together. And that sort of was, okay, this is the ingredients with which we are looking here inside us, in which we will attract our money. And that good data and that clarity are the basis of absolutely everything. It makes a huge difference to separate perception from reality. And critically, where we helped our partners to do this very first step, we often find that there is a couple of 1 or 2 dominant forms of funding that actually do work, leaving us to think, well, why are we not investing more into what we know works? So the debunking this sometimes myth of diversification a little bit, which we can talk about later. Step number 2 is therefore look around. That was pretty much what Jasmina just described, answering the question, what do we need and what is actually available? What is our donor audience? Which donors are listening to us? Not necessarily who is funding us, because the donors we are talking to who find that interesting, Jasmina, you've just mentioned it in a half sentence, they are the ones who are more like to fund us, right? Who do we share an audience with? Can we partner with them? What funding might be ideal for our partners? Are we really the right organization to receive that funding? So again, tackling on, bolting on to what Jasmina just said. and how much do we actually need, and what are the key competitive forces. And to give you a pragmatic example, again, we have listed out for another partner organization, NGO, in a very scientific smiley system, simply the various types of funding there is. So here are the grants, here are the service contracts, here's a membership scheme. And for that particular organization, we said, okay, these factors in the funding are really, really important. We need to have, total flexibility of how we use the fund because circumstances are changing on the ground so fast. Well, government grants is not the best way of doing that. Once you're committed, you need to implement this. A membership scheme is unrestricted, much better. But we also want to have a level, we need to have a reasonable low effort of securing the funding. Again, the membership scheme takes huge amounts to invest. That is probably not the best way to put our money and our time and our precious resources. We also really want to repeat the funding source. We don't want to continually develop every year new donors. So again, government grants are certainly partially successful. However, we find that a fundraising campaign is pretty repeatable. And by looking at this not at all scientific smiley system, it just allowed for a better conversation to go carte blanche and say, look, let's consider all types of funding before we default back on what we know, which is our grants. Should we, for example, invest into an income generating activity or a business? Is that something we really need to do? And there are some organizations which have done that and had great successes, and for some, it's really not for them. Right, then moving on to the sort of third step after looking around, we really want to look ahead. Again, following on to what Jasmina kind of said, that is where the BHAC comes in. So we want to determine the path to a more secure funding, score them against the likelihood from step number 2 that I just said, the smiley system. Let's score that, how likely are we to succeed here, and against the investment that we need from step 1. And if you then multiply them, you pretty much semi-scientifically have determined your best possible funding source without automatically going back to what we're used to. And bearing in mind the strengths and weaknesses from step 1, we will at this stage have a look at the competitive forces, the opportunities, and the threats from others. So as you probably realize by now, that creates your full SWOT analysis in order to define your funding strategy. And then my last 2 tips here are, once you've made the decision on that one, invest wisely, not miserably. There is nothing more frustrating to me than having found the right funding strategy and then putting 5 grand towards it. That is just not putting the fuel into the car that we just so carefully selected. Trust the German to use a car metaphor, apologies. But once we've agreed on these 3 steps, then we need to really boost this vehicle. And one thing that has come, one feedback that our partner organizations in the UK and around the world have frequently come back to me is saying, well, we're just sort of stuck. Yes, we know we've done this look in, look around, look ahead, but what now? So that's where the BHAC comes in, the big, hairy, audacious goal. And the reaction we sometimes get is, wow, that's a very big and a very important question. Let's do it later. That is obviously a reaction you might experience in some of your organizations. So the 3 reasons, my colleagues and I sort of ask ourselves, what are the 3 major reasons these big projects, these initiatives to really change our funding paradigm do not proceed, despite the knowledge that it needs to change? And we've come up with 3 possible, most frequent, the greatest hits of why we do not tackle this big, hairy, audacious goal. Either it's just a big issue and a high risk. So it's recognized as a big problem. It requires lots of time, money, and energy to solve. And the organization just finds it too risky to invest the time, and time is money, of course. Or there just simply isn't enough time. They're up against so many deadlines, we just don't have the time. And most commonly, we find a simple reason, just plain stuck. You know, there are, you know, some important projects like this. They're very important. They never somehow seem very urgent, so they're just hard to kick off, and they lose momentum. So in order to help this, I want to share with you a methodology that you can do. Again, no consultant needed really. You can do that internally. Is to do a sprint. And what's important to notice here is that, you know, I would love to tell you that MzN has all the answers and my colleagues around the world are funding experts that know everything about every donor. That is not necessarily true. We do not have all solutions, but we find that you do, that our partner organizations actually do. They just need a framework to put it together. So we've used this for a number of partners, the sprint, and you can run your own sprint within the next 3 to 4 weeks if you wanted to. I'm happy to sort of share the methodology if you want to get in touch. It's basically a high pressure event of 4 to 5 days where you invite 7 to 10 people, including the 1 or 2 decision makers. And you align the team around this big, hairy, audacious goal. And the idea by Friday afternoon, 4 p.m. is you have a roadmap to fix it. So it's a methodology that I'm, again, happy to share, combines your theory of change with a startup business canvas, which most organizations we work with found quite useful, because the theory of change is obviously your theory of change, your way how we create impact. Your business startup canvas is a well-known, you know, tried and proven and tested methodology to start a business. And putting these two together in a pressure cooker event of just 4 days tends to 9 times out of 10 unstuck this big, hairy, audacious goal. You absolutely can run your own sprint in 3 to 4 weeks. I highly recommend it to get unstuck. And getting 5 to 6 people into a room for 4 days might sound like a lot of investment, but it sounds a lot less daunting than saying we need to, you know, tenfold our funding over the last 10 years, which is absolutely possible. And then just to give you a sort of timeline, that this needn't be an open-ended project. We've worked with some of our partners that I've, you know, some of them are reflected here, some of them might be here. We've done these phases in 3 to 4 months' time with tiny startup organizations and big international confederations and even donors themselves. So including UNICEF, for example, or, you know, BRAC, a huge organization, where within 5 months, partially overlapping, these 3 distinct phases were done. And as I said, in 9 times out of 10, it actually sets up a whole new funding strategy into motion. I'm absolutely convinced that the answers to the challenges we are all solving are within your organizations. They're not with external consultants. You may use someone to facilitate and sort of team it out, but there's no external input you need or anybody needs in order to get to the answers of how we change our funding paradigm. And hopefully these few slides give you a methodology, or at least inspiration towards a methodology to get unstuck and tackle this BHAG. And that's it. Hopefully we can talk about it. I hope I'm within time, Mike. You can also, of course, go to the website and check out, which is brand new as per yesterday, by the way. My colleagues told me, I haven't checked it out yet. Probably should. And then Mike mentioned that with the next one is all about how we become more innovative and agile at the end of October. Et voila, that's it. Shall I stop sharing screen?
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Janina. And do please ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll endeavour to answer them. One of the things that that really struck me, Jasmine, was you talking about the hamster wheel of not having enough and being driven by impact rather than the need to raise a specific fund. Now, there's a kind of internal cultural dimension to that, and who did you have to persuade to let the organisation operate in that way, and how difficult was that? Was there a sort of period of time in which that sort of transition took place? And could you just talk a little bit more about that and just sort of perhaps give people guidance people who are stuck on this hamster wheel, what's the recipe for getting out of that and getting towards this impact-driven funding approach?
I would say start with your CEO and convince her or him or them as best as you can that this is the right direction. I think for us, one of the good things about Integrity Action in this respect was our size. And when you're our size, you know, your CEO is not a person out there and you don't have team over there trying to slowly crawl to and book meetings to have a discussion around this. I think for us, it was a conversation around sitting down and really honestly looking into sources of issues that we have within the organization and speaking very, very openly and very plainly. And after one of those sessions, we just sat down and I thought, you know, if we were replaced tomorrow morning with completely new set of staff, what would these people do if they were faced with these challenges and if they knew exactly this? And really the answer was there. We just needed to push away our to-date experience with the organization and that notion, that feeling of, but this is how we run. We thought, no, this can be different. After that point, when you have your executive team absolutely on the same page and committed to the change, is the conversation with board. And I'm not sure about structures in other countries, but in the UK, typically we will sit down with our board once a quarter and goes through meaty, substantial strategic issues. And this is definitely one of those ones. I would say to all CEOs, start the conversation with your board, with your chair as fast as possible. Bring this to the board slowly, gently over 3 sessions and be very, very, very clear about articulating the change and bring those examples from the ground level where you are attempting to make difference. I completely understand from board members' position when CEO opens mouth and saying, I would like to introduce a change that will bring income down, but the results will be better. They'll be like, oh my word, what are you saying? And because we're used to that environment where our successes are measured by the level of income we're able to raise, we still have those divisions, you know, CEOs of small charities into this room, and with you we will discuss these things. CEOs of large NGOs, you go over there, and with you we will discuss these strategic issues. When in fact you have pretty much the same professionals working across the spectrum. I think with the board, it's all about that reassurance and try to remember those board members were attracted by reaching the mission rather than those right targets. I would say with our board, we're absolutely on the same page, and it just is fabulous. It has changed dynamic around that discussion around the board. My board is far better able to challenge us on impact side than previously they were, because the conversation is a lot clearer. They will say things, well, but how do you know? Have you asked citizens? How do you know? Have you asked partners, and etc.? So I think it's probably easier than I thought it would be at the beginning. I thought this might easily turn into 2 or 3 years long process, but for us it was fairly fast. So key decision makers, your executive team, your board, get it going.
Thank you. And Chris, do you have any observations? I mean, you and I have talked in the past about how boards can be, you know, the general operational literacy of boards can be an issue, and we've talked about you know, boards sometimes being an obstacle towards mergers. I mean, how are you seeing boards thinking about funding? Do you think they're changing in their approach?
Yeah, I actually like Jasmina's sort of approach here that you've just mentioned. This over a course of 3 meetings for a large organization, be very, very, very clear. And I think this look in, look around, and then look ahead strategy still works with the boards as well. When it comes to sort of funding strategy, I find boards are typically full of characters who have very strong opinions and a good network and a lot of drive, and that's fantastic unless you need to change their minds. And I mean, Jasmina, you tell me, you probably have tons of experience with that. What worked well is if we said, look, let's just do a single board meeting where, and sometimes it takes an external to sort of present this, just because there is not this career agenda suspicion. Where we just do saying, look, we don't ask them anything, we just want to give you an update as to the funding we have, the funding that worked, and the funding there is. And no more, we're not asking for a change. And then in the next board meeting, a couple of months later, or even in between the meetings, that change is happening. What I think doesn't work, and which is if anybody asks for an immediate rapid change that will cost money, intensive time, and goes contrary to what these people immediately think, and that's bound to be voted down. And I think we have to remember that not just NGOs, companies as well, they're not monolithic single things. They are big ships, and they sometimes take a couple of nudges to change direction.
Thanks, Chris. Amara has asked you a question, Jasmine, about whether you've had any pushbacks from funders and challenges to your approach. Can you give any texture to that question at all?
Of course, absolutely. But then again, I think with funders who pushed back, to be honest, they were prodding rather than pushing back. They just wanted to prod to see how certain are we about it, and are we going to change our course after a year, and etc. The biggest, I think the most significant prodding came from our biggest supporters, the ones who are providing us with unrestricted funding and the ones who really want to see our mission happen. And they were asking very, very good questions around, well, if you pursue this strategy, fair enough, absolutely, we're buying in on with that commitment towards impact and all the rest. But what does drop in income, what will it trigger with funders who are not as enlightened as possibly some are? What happens if you set these standards so high that suddenly not that many funders fit the bill? And what happens if your dream funders that you really want to raise money from, if they say no, where do you go? Where do you go from here? And those are all very fair questions. And to be honest, we have thought through most of those. Nothing really came as a surprise to some of those questions. I don't know what the answer is, and I was very open and honest about it. And those funders are still with us. What it all looks like in 3 or 4 years' time, I really don't know. But I'm absolutely adamant this is the right way to go, and it will shield us in years to come from shockers like FCDO pulling rugs under our feet, or large institutional funders, or trust and foundations deciding to focus on domestic issues rather than international development, and etc. I think we just have we are rolling out the approach sooner than we would have otherwise been forced to implement. So I don't think this is controversial.
And just, Chris, I've got something I wanted to ask you, which isn't in the actual list of questions, but you came up with this phrase, which I really liked, which was investing wisely, not miserly, and coming up with a grand scheme and then throwing £5,000 at it. What would you say to people? How would you suggest people think about the amount they need to invest? How can you provide a bit more guidance on what appropriate investment should look like?
Well, look, any investment is a risk. we're investing money and time and energy, most importantly, in order to get a return for our ultimately our impact generation activity, our impact generation potential. And insofar, that risk is sometimes worthwhile taking and sometimes not. If, however, you decide on a funding strategy that is changing or even radically changing what you've done before based on good analysis, then the risk of not doing anything is actually a lot bigger than investing it. So people start to say, oh, hang on, we need to invest 20, 40, 50K of staff time, expert time, et cetera, into this new funding strategy. Let's not do that. We appreciate the data. You're absolutely right about your conclusions, but let's not act. And that is incredibly demotivating, and I'm yet to see the organization which has fared well as a response of that. The worst thing, there was one partner organization last year who have gone through the board approval and then halved the investment into the new strategy. And the strategy is a investment on an outcome in future. And the likelihood of that outcome being satisfactory just increases if you properly resource it. For many, not even just for financial reasons, staff will feel a lot more motivated saying, okay, well, board and the organization is dipping into its reserves. They really are meaning business with this new strategy. It's not just the new thing. Properly resourcing it just makes it this much more likely to actually succeed. There is a thing as saving ourselves to death.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris. People are very interested in your organisation, Jasmina, and I've got Sarah asking a question about. Obviously, you're an enlightened senior team. So what I think Sarah's sort of asking, what do you do if your senior team isn't quite so enlightened as yours? How do you go about persuading them to introduce the approach that you've been talking about, a kind of bottom-up approach?
Well, I think it's good to have a conversation, and to open that conversation, please. I think it's good to reach out to people for whom are absolutely doing this, myself included. And if always happy to speak to other people about what the opportunities are, risks, and how it all goes, and all the rest of it. And this is going to sound really, really horrible, but if you have the executive team for whom this is going to sound, oh my word, what on earth are you on about? You have the wrong executive team. And I think if there is a wrong executive team running the organization, we all know what's the conversation that needs to be done. We've all kind of been in those situations at some point in our careers, or will be at some point in our careers, but that's why we have healthy governance structures where organizations are not in ownership of CEO or executive team. There are boards, there are other people involved, and I think this is the right conversation to instigate.
Totally agree.
Chris, people are interested in the sprint approach, and Zoe's asking, do you think you can do a more spread out sprint so people don't have to give up so much time in one go, or is the essence of is the purpose of the sprint to do it as a sprint? You compact and compress decision making into a very short space of time. Just to amplify a bit on the process of doing a sprint, and perhaps talk a bit more about the best approaches to developing a sprint within an organization that's not used to using that approach.
No, it's come straight of our work from agile and innovation work over the last 10 or 15 years or so, which we talked plenty of time here together. And yes, the clue's in the name. It's a sprint, not a marathon. So we really did experiment about 6-month long sprints. We did experiment with 3-day sprints. We experimented with remote sprints. And to be very blunt and very clear, none of them really work. The sprint methodology is it's a well-known concept in the tech industry, that we've adopted it to the nonprofit industry. And it has, for a 3 to 5 day sprint, has really shown itself, composed of 7 people. That's not a random number either. Has really shown itself to galvanize energy and be this high pressure event. Basically, you walk in the room on Monday morning at 10 a.m. and by Friday or by Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m., you need to present a strategy, a roadmap, or a solution to the problem, your BHAG problem, to your board, to the donor, to your partner organizations, wherever. So you're setting yourself up as with a facilitated high pressure event. And the other reality here is we all, the sprint is a highly productive, distraction-free work environment. There's only like 4 or 5 hours of work a day, but we have a strict no device policy and a strict to be in the room policy during those sprints. And that means, the days that are usually so loud and so distracted by fractions of screens, messages that disrupt our concentration. In the sprint, you get these 7 people together for 5-6 hours a day, times 4 times 5. So you get a good 30 hours done per person. You probably haven't had this much work done in the organization over the last year. And that really combines it. Combine that with by Friday we need to really present something, has resulted in some excellent work. And that also convinced me that the solution is within the team, not some external consultant. So our role, MzN, is often just to facilitate it rather than actually come up with a solution.
And perhaps, Chris and I can talk about this afterwards, perhaps this is something we can cover in a bit more detail at a future webinar, is how to run a sprint. And just to say, anyone who's interested in this, with MzN, we're running a series of 3 webinars, I think starting on 27th of October, which is going to look at innovation and agility in organizations. And I think, our previous experiences, what's been really good about working with Chris and MzN before is really demystifying terms like innovation and agility, which are so can be so intimidating to people, and they need not be. And I think there's what we've seen is there are approaches that you can take which are just part of your standard operations that lead to innovation, that lead to agility, and it's just a different way of organizing yourself rather than some lightning bolt. So do come along if you're interested in that aspect of rethinking the way you work.
I think we just lost Mike, right? The connection. Jasmine, can you still see him, Janina?
No, I can't. We've lost Mike.
All right, well, we'll just continue. I think, look, the sprint methodology is useful. And I think just to follow on what Mike just said, the fact of the matter is, whether it's a big audacious funding goal or anything else, we can basically, I'm pretty convinced, engineer a solution to that. And it's never going to be perfect. It's always, but if we get to 80%, that's probably pretty good. And you might be
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious of the time, and I have this burning question to ask.
Go ahead.
I agree the loads of solutions are within teams and brainstorming, lock people up for 5 days and you can get something out. But how do you overcome this challenge? Within our teams, we're together all the time, and we have knowledge that we share amongst ourselves as colleagues all the time. And there are also some team dynamics. Some people like to be more vocal than the others. Some people will know a bit more about specific funders that you're targeting within the sprint. So how do you balance that dynamic? How do you balance the dynamic, and how do you compensate for the knowledge the team might not have about funders that might be the most relevant ones?
So I love the questions. I mean, I'm glad that Mike is gone, because otherwise he would refuse us to go off this topic of funding. So let's just go with it until the internet connection is reestablished, as long as the adults are out of the room, so to speak. Look, the sprint lives and dies with its preparation. So I said to you earlier, I alluded to the fact that there are sort of 7 people, or maybe maximum 10, or even fewer. And when we facilitate a sprint, it's pretty strict, said the German accountant. I'm sorry to play on the stereotype here, but look, you're going to have a decider who has the authority and the mandate to decide on something. So, for example, recently we we facilitated a sprint for a humanitarian organization that said we need to have the ability to set up responses within 60 days. How do we do that? That wasn't a funding-related sprint. That was although it included funding, that was a different sprint. So we had a decider, then we had the finance expert, someone who knows, where the money comes from, how we spend it. We had the sort of communications expert in the room, saying how do we actually communicate that. We had the project managers saying this is what we're doing, 1 or 2 of them, and finally sort of a tech or logistics experts. And sometimes if it's a large organization, we had a couple of newbies in, someone who's not confined by how things used to be done. And by day 2, these solutions tend to be really balanced out. If you compose the sprint right, then you usually avoid that decider dominance problem. Hey, Mike, we're just talking about recipes and cooking.
I'm back. Sorry about that. So there was I've lost the questions that were in the question box, but I know there was one question about specific approaches to funding for smaller organisations. And Integrity Action isn't a large organisation by any means, is it, Jasmina? So
no.
I think. No. So just talk a little bit about these approaches and how they might work in small organizations and what advice you can provide, because lots of bond members are small and they're always looking for, as you know because Bond runs a group for chief execs of small organizations, and there's lots of them, the more innovative thinking, I think, happens in that group rather than, I shouldn't say this, but than in the larger and larger organizations group. So just tell us a little bit more about what you advise for smaller organizations, both of you. If I start off with you, Jasmina, it'd be good to get your thoughts.
I think just being very, very realistic and very brutal in that, matching what is it that you can do that creates impact with appropriate funders. I think that's the key, and designing your team structure, that your programs team, that people who know intimately what makes the difference, the learning that's coming into the organization, that they're the ones driving setting of those fundraising targets. I'm always really conscious about spending time with how much time I spent with different funders. Sometimes it's really tempting when you get an invitation from a big name to be in some room for 3 hours where you brainstorm this and that. Deep down, I know really that we're not going to get a penny from them. So why should I be there? Or am I better off speaking to a funder who I know has £20,000 and who could be helping our targets? I will absolutely go with a lot, and being really, really brutal about how you spend your time. And another very important thing, being really, really realistic. If you haven't said a boo to a funder, if they're really not in conversation with you, don't even begin to imagine that you're going to get money from them within the current financial year. It really doesn't happen. Yeah. It might be a fluke, but I've stopped doing that a couple of years ago. I used to do it a lot.
And Chris, what would you, thanks Jasmina, what would you add to that?
I would just actually confirm what Jasmina said, being absolutely ruthless about the time we spend and where we spend it. And just to really reinforce the thinking, if there's when we talk about funding in particular, there is a myth about this diversification. I think we need to realize, and this may be the subject of another talk one day, we need to realize that diversification is incredibly important, but what scales an NGO is the 1 or 2 dominant forms of funding that really work. So yes, diversify every year in your attempts to get new funding so that you don't miss out. But once you know that a certain type of funding is working, then you don't diversify, then you optimize. So then you really want to, for example, if you do find out that EU or German or FCDO or this fundraising fund really brings home the bacon, then you want to optimize, you want to lower the costs of the bid, you want to increase the frequency of your submissions, you want to graduate your fundraising donors to a higher value or to a membership model. So diversify in your attempts, but really optimize in what you know already works. In other words, if you know something works, stop looking.
Yes, it's very interesting, and it's diversification is often seen as the holy grail of NGO funding, isn't it? But as you say, there are yeah, doubling down on your successes is also it may be a much more productive approach.
I mean, ideally you do both, right, Mike? I mean, ideally you continue to try out other things, because who knows, you might find a second big source of type of funding that works. Yeah. You never want to lose this edge, and obviously you shouldn't rely on one donor only. You know, I'm not saying just focus on FCDO. That is a recipe for disaster that will go wrong one day.
Yes.
Not just specifically FCDO, but yeah, specifically FCDO. But if you know institutional grants, West Africa, in this funding sweet spot that works, then stop looking and go for it.
Great, thank you. We're coming up to the hour, so I think we'll bring our discussion to a halt. Thank you very much for all the questions that people have posed. And just to say that the next one in this series, which follows on perfectly from what Chris was just talking about, is around aligning to donor strategies. So that's going to take place on December the 1st. You can already book on that on the Bond website now. It's already up there. And just remains for me to thank Jasmina. Lots of interest in your work, and the example that you've brought to us, absolutely fascinating. Love to talk to you more about that as well sometime, and to thank Chris as well from MzN. And we will see Chris again on October the 27th, when we'll start our Agile and innovation conversation. So do please join us for that as well, and thank you for taking part. Great to see you all again.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye for now. Bye, everybody.
Bye.